Hello from Costa Rica. Thanks for your video. I absolutely loved it. Don't mind me as I'm filming in an extra room in my host family's house. So thanks for your video. Loved it. After watching your video about podcasts, it kind of inspired me to make a little response to your video on podcast and talk about my own journey through podcasts. So here we go. So probably the first podcast I listened to was Ear Biscuits. Ear Biscuits is by Link and Rhett from Good Mythical Morning. A common thread through this is that I have to know of the person through another route and then I listen to their podcast, if that makes sense. I remember when Miss Sanchez made us make a podcast for our research paper, and she was saying, "Oh, and add some background music like normal podcasts do." And I was like, yeah, sure, I know what a normal podcast does. And then you and Vanessa were like both like fangirling over, "Oh my gosh, podcasts, we love podcasts, woo!" And I was like, I just like didn't understand the appeal of listening to other people talk, because I was like, I want to talk too. And then I was thinking about it, and that was senior year. I listened to Ear Biscuits summer of junior year because I would listen to it while picking up balls on the driving range. So I don't understand. Maybe I just had like a block of like a mental block of all the times that I'd listened to Ear Biscuits. But anyway, Ear Biscuits, my first podcast, always will be in my heart. Next, of course, is Dear Hank and John with, of course, John and Hank Green. So I was like writing down a script to this, and I was like, I can't remember when I started listening to it, but it's like always been such a comfort podcast. Like I had to listen to it in like high school because it's just such a comfort thing to me to listen to, and I just like feel so connected to them, and I just I love it. And I feel like it's probably the podcast that I've listened to consistently for the longest, though I've yet to like go back to the earlier episodes and listen to those, so one day I will do that. One thing about this podcast is we got to bond over it. And I wrote originally in my script that we got to bond over this podcast. But then I realized I was going through a little deep dive of my texts, of our text conversations. Mainly I just looked up podcasts in my texts. And I found a text from May 22nd, 2020, when you asked me if I had ever listened to John and Hank's podcast. And I answered, I have not. It wasn't until 2020 that I listened to them. Because I thought like for sure this was something long before 2020. And then I found another text from June 4th where you were like, you need to listen to their podcast. You would love it, I swear. And I was like, got it. I have a problem when people suggest things to me to like listen to or watch or have a read. I just don't want to do it. Oh, June 26, 2020, I texted you saying that I was obsessed with the podcast, which I find absolutely adorable. And then August 31st, I suggested the podcast to another person. So quick turnaround there, but kind of crazy to me how I convinced myself that like I found this on my own, and then we like happen to bond over it, like, wow, we both listen to the same thing. No, you introduced me to it, so huge big props and thanks to you for that. I have like such great memories with that podcast. Like one of them, I was like driving home and I remember laughing so hard there were just like tears streaming down my face. I think it was about the one where they were trying to calculate the foot size of or boot size of Italy. That one I just found absolutely hilarious. Other memories of like me playing NBA 2K13 and doing puzzles like on the living room floor, having that in the background while my mom was upstairs doing work. Like, and I just remember her going, "Who is that talking?" Next one, kind of short-lived. Not really short-lived. It's just the book came out. but Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. I think the first one I listened to was the Academic episode, also suggested by you. And then I went to be like, oh my God, that podcast was amazing too. And our text afterwards, which again, is absolutely adorable. I haven't listened to this one as consistently, even though it's so relaxing. And I love his video on, I don't know how to say the song, so I'm just going to say the New Year's Day song. I absolutely love that episode and the videos that he makes about it every year. And then I think around this time of 2020, you're resting on a piano, just to give you an insight. I was recommended, after trying to rekindle a friendship with a very old, an old neighbor blast from the past, trying to rekindle our friendship, he suggested to me an Enneagram podcast because we both found out we love Enneagrams. This one is called The Road Back to You. It's a little Christian-y. It has a lot of Christian language, which makes sense because the Enneagram does come from a Christian mindset or Christian philosophers. But I really liked this podcast, but mainly only for the ones that mentioned 9. It gave me a cool way of thinking of being a 9, which is the idea of inertia. 9s, once they get going, but then once they stop, they stop. And so that is definitely me. So then related to this is Sleeping at Last podcast. I love Sleeping at Last. He just makes me so happy. Ryan is such a down-to-earth person and just so genuine. Also, he's a 9, so that helps. But his podcast just makes me fall in love with his music even more every time I listen to it. The amount of meaning and thought and so much process that is put into making every song, it's absolutely insane. So it's always really cool to hear how those songs that I love, especially the Enneagram series, which I made you listen to, one of them, 2 of them. And his Enneagram series really made me fall in love with Enneagram, but also his album and his music. He's just amazing. I love him. So then there was I have just a list on here of different podcasts that I use to go to sleep. So I'll run quickly through them. So we have The Empty Spoon, which is a podcast that talks about the latest news in cereal, which I think is just hilarious and amazing. It does include one of the McElroy brothers, so maybe that's why I loved it. But then I loved it too much, so I couldn't listen to it while falling asleep. I have a whole bunch of Spanish podcasts. If you look through my I don't know what you call it, my library of recently listened to is just a bunch of Spanish podcasts because I was trying to find a good Spanish podcast to listen to. I recently found one by people in Costa Rica, so I can get used to that dialect. So I think my thinking behind this was that the Spanish would seep into my brain while I fell asleep. And then when I wake up, I'm suddenly fluent. Hasn't happened yet. We'll be waiting to see if it does happen. We have Sleep With Me, pretty good sleep podcast. I sometimes get annoyed with him because he spends so long talking about ads in the beginning, but that's one of his tactics to get you to go to sleep is ads are so boring, so you fall asleep. But I just found them very annoying. So I don't listen to them as much. I have been listening more recently to Sherlock Holmes books. And by recently, I mean the past 2 days to fall asleep. So I read some Sherlock Holmes books in middle school. And I remember reading it on my Kindle and having to constantly highlight different words because there were so many big words that I didn't know. And so then when I was looking for sleep podcasts, I was like, oh, Sherlock Holmes, that had a lot of big words and it could be a little tiresome to get through. So maybe I'll read those. And then another one that started as a sleep podcast was My Brother and Me, which turned into me absolutely falling in love with it. because it was too funny to listen to while trying to go to sleep. So it's probably like my second comfort show. And by comfort, I mean smiling and laughing so hard that people around me think I'm crazy, especially when I'm going on a walk or just like sitting on an airplane and I start laughing to myself. That's because I'm listening to the McElroy brothers. So whenever I listen to them, I get in these like really like creative, like a funny way moods, like I can be hilarious, and like my dream is just to have people who I can bant with back and forth. Like that's like the kind of weird creativity that I get from this podcast. But then other times I just get genuine like joy and happiness because it's so cute. It's such a great podcast. Yeah, that turned from a sleep podcast to I wouldn't call it an obsession, but bordering on it. And then, related to that, when I had shared with somebody that I liked the McElroy brothers, they were like, oh, I only know them from their D&D series. And I was like, So then I ended up listening to a little bit of their D&D series. Not much of it, but this is like summer 2021 where it's farm me, like me being alone in Cleveland for the whole summer. So during this era, it was like the D&D podcast from the McElroys. One called The Happiness Lab, which talked about different ways you can like achieve happiness, I guess, or like experience happiness, which I found really cool. And it like included a lot of science, which is cool. Then there's like some short-lived information podcasts where I asked this very smart guy in my political science classes what podcast he listens to, because he's always like, in this podcast that I listened to, they talked about this, and now I know about this, and like I wanted to be like him. I was like, oh, he's so cool, like, wow, I need to know this. So he suggested to me Star Talk, Intelligence Matters, and Stuff They Don't Want You to Know. So for a while I was trying to listen to these, trying to make myself smarter, but it didn't work out too well. Then we come to more recently, which is I think Smartless, which I listened to the summer of 2022 and maybe like the Christmas of 2022. I don't know. All I can associate it is with puzzling on the dining room table. It was just really funny. It's with Jason Bateman, Sean Hayes, and Will Arnett. And they have like celebrity guests on it, and they talk about the most random things. These three, I love the banter they have with between them. They always like gang up on Sean Hayes, a little bit of a hate crime, but it's just like so adorable and so funny. And then the occasional Taskmaster podcast where I want to like listen more about my favorite British comedians. And then most recently, I've been trying to get myself into this one podcast called The Gender Spiral. This is a podcast and they bring on different people who have experience with transitioning or experiencing gender or understanding gender in a way that is different than what is like commonly viewed or conceptualized in our society. And so I've been trying to listen to a little bit more of that. I listened to it a couple of times on the way to and from training because it's like a 30-minute walk. So like I'd listen to that or my brother and me to get myself to laugh. But this podcast, it was really comforting at first, but then it started to make me just like sad and a little bit jealous of how these people get to experience their gender in such a unique and great way. Whereas lately I feel more like regressed in how I'm trying to express my gender or how I understand my gender. I haven't been listening to it as much because I don't want to make myself so sad. So we'll stick with the happy ones. That's my journey through podcasts. I hope you learned something about me in my podcast life, because I definitely learned about myself and my podcast life, given that I thought I found some of these podcasts on my own, whereas I definitely did not, and then they were suggested to me. I think that's all. I'll see you next time. Bye.